All right, so I'm going to show you how I made my little leather dragon, which is now my new logo. I drew the design up myself on the computer using the drawing program that I use, which is called Leonardo. And then I tidied up my lines in Inkscape. This is the pattern that I just printed out. I'm cutting the rough outline of the pattern out using an X-Acto knife. I covered the back side of the pattern in packing tape. The reason for that is just to make it waterproof, basically, so that when I'm tracing the pattern onto the leather, it doesn't wrinkle or distort. You always want to make sure that you're using a really sharp knife. So I'm just breaking my blade off here because the tip of the blade got chipped. I'm just laying out my leather here. This is a very thin veg tan. I think it's probably about a 2 or 3 ounce. Because we're doing such intense detailed molding and shaping with this project, the thinner the leather, the better. I think if I went any thicker than like a 4 or 5 ounce, this pattern would not work. With this thinness of leather, it is going to be pretty floppy at the end, but I'm planning on mounting it on the wall, so that isn't going to be a problem. I soaked this leather completely, so I submerged it in water until no more bubbles were rising to the surface, so I know it's completely drenched. This is way too wet to be doing tracing, but it's working. Just tracing around the pattern with a dull pencil. It's pretty hard to see on camera, but I'm able to see it well enough. I'm cutting the dragon out with a sharp X-Acto knife. This is my excited, impatient brain kicking in because I just threw the leather in water without thinking about it, and I really should have cut it out while it was still dry. Derp. You can cut out leather when it's wet, it's just when it's completely soaked through like this, and especially because it's such thin leather, it's very floppy, which just makes it more difficult to cut out. As always, it's good to cut long sweeping lines in one stroke if you can. And if you're coming back over the same stroke more than once, make sure to not tilt your blade from side to side so that your line is going to look nice and clean. Sharp corners I always cut towards the outside, shaving off the rounded outer bits. These thin bits here are really where it's becoming more difficult because it's wet, but I make it work. What do you think we should name my dragon? When I started, I thought I was going to paint him blue, like the ice dragon form of Viserion, but it kind of ended up going in a different direction in the end. You'll see. So I just placed the pattern back over top of the leather so that I could trace the eyes on, and now I'm cutting the eyes out. This is a little bit tricky, just using the point of the X-Acto knife there. So now I'm going to trace the other details of the pattern on. Again, this is something that would work way better if the leather wasn't so wet. But because we're doing some really intense wet shaping here, I need to start my shaping while it's pretty wet, which is why I am tracing the design now, even though this is suboptimal conditions for tracing. If the leather is much drier, by which I mean properly cased, damp in the middle and fairly dry on the surface, tracing the pattern like this will show up really well. It'll transfer really nicely. And if you want to transfer a detailed pattern, that is the much better way to go about it. When the leather is super, super wet, it's like almost mushy, which is not ideal for holding any kind of a pattern, whether it's shaping or tooling or tracing designs onto the leather. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut out all of the spines along his back. You can cut the outside of leather with scissors if you want to, but for cuts like this on the interior of the leather, obviously scissors are not going to work, and you'll have no choice but to use an X-Acto knife for them. I personally prefer an X-Acto knife for all of my leather cutting, unless I'm doing like just a really cutting out a really rough piece, but for anything detailed, I've always used a knife, and that's just what I'm comfortable with. I'm just folding up all of the spines just to kind of get a sense of how this is going to look. And now I'm starting to shape. So the leather here is super wet and floppy, but when I'm doing really intense wet shaping, I personally like to start with my leather being totally wet, especially when I'm dealing with such thin areas like this. Some of these are going to dry really, really fast. So I want to give myself enough time to get the shaping in before everything dries out too much, especially these sharp folds along the wings. I really like to get my sharp, intense bends in while the leather is really wet and floppy, and then slowly add more detail as the leather dries down. I can focus on the thin areas, which are going to dry faster, and then work my way into the other areas as they dry. This is where I'm talking about the thickness of the leather is really important. If you went any thicker than, say, probably like a 4 or 5 ounce, even a 4 or 5 ounce, you wouldn't get quite the depth of folds in it that I'm getting right here, unless you thinned it out with a skiver on the big folded parts, which is, you could do that. So I'm coming in with a stylus, working the leather from the back, trying to slowly build up those details. All right, so I used a swivel knife in a couple places. Once again, this leather is way too wet for tooling and for swivel knifing, but I need to start shaping this now while it's still really wet. So I am doing a little bit of tooling sooner than it would be ideal. Now I'm using a mule's foot stamp to stamp in the scales. This is such a teeny tiny stamp, so this is a really slow process. I'm not being too perfect about the placement of these, kind of going a little bit random and slowly working my way up the back of the dragon, having the spines always pointed down towards the tail. Here I'm using a backgrounding stamp to add just a teeny tiny bit of texture to the wings. I didn't go very deep or hard with this stamp. I just wanted to add a little bit of texture here and there. Now that the leather is starting to dry down, I'm adding some more detail to the face. I'm using a rounded stylus here just to stretch out the eye holes, kind of press the eyelids into the shape that I want. Now I'm folding the nose in half, curling up his little whiskers, using a tiny stylus to aid in folding the horns in half. This is such a tiny little detail to work on with leather, so it is really tricky and finicky, and you just got to take it slow and careful with very small tools. So as the leather gets drier, it's going to hold more and more detail. So I'm coming back over the same areas over and over again, adding a little bit more detail as it dries. The face got a little bit too dry, so I'm just re-wetting it here so I can shape it. That's the problem with shaping something that has all of these different shapes. Some areas are going to dry faster than others. If you need to re-wet the leather to continue working it, that's totally fine. This is pretty tiny for the amount of detail, so it's a little bit finicky, and I'm just slowly working it into place. So now I just set the dragon aside so that it could dry completely. I usually leave it at least overnight, sometimes longer if it's thicker leather, but this leather should dry pretty quick. As kind of an afterthought, I decided to add claws to the front of his wings. I just re-wet the tips of his wings, pressed them in with a pointy stylus. Then I punched a hole at the tip of each of the wings so that I could insert the claw. And then I just molded those whole shapes, pressing them in so that they would receive the claws nicely, stretching that hole out with my pointy stylus, just folding them underneath a little bit. And once I was happy with the position of them, I just left it to dry. And here's my little guy. He's all dry, but he just looks a little bit darker because I oiled him up. The leather I used was an old piece of scrap that had been banging around forever, so I wanted to make sure that it was moisturized. I used some air dry clay to make him a couple of little claws. And I found these beads in my drawer that I thought were a good size for eyes. I wasn't totally sure if I was going to use them. They're a little bit derpy, but I did end up using them, but I painted them a different color. I'm going to start coloring the leather. So I am using EcoFlow dye. So I don't like EcoFlow dye for anything where durability is a major concern, like belts and stuff like that. I found the level of dye rub off to be rather unacceptable. I've also found that it seems to fade more quickly. I prefer Phoebings for that kind of work, but I do frequently use EcoFlow for things like masks or other small decorative items like this. I love the color range that EcoFlow has. They have a full range and rainbow of colors, which is really nice. Phoebings is starting to come out with some other colors like these yellows and blues. But when I started leatherworking, Phoebings did not have anything other than browns and blacks and reds. The other nice thing about EcoFlow is that it is water-based, which means you can water it down with plain water. So I'm using it just like a paint here, like a watercolored paint, and I have watered it down significantly. You can see how thin it is here. This dye is pretty dark if you apply it at 100% strength, but I've watered it down pretty significantly because I want to build up the color. I want to do shading, some varied depth of color. Just coloring some sections of the backside so that I make sure I get color onto the edges of the leather and onto the inside of those spines. You can see that to a certain extent the dye is re-wetting the leather and making it floppy again. So I'm just trying to be careful not to squish it out of shape, and I may have to reshape a couple of the areas when I'm done before I let it dry. I'm doing this super sloppy. This is just for me. It's going to go on the wall. I'm not overly fussed about perfection with this. This is not for sale. One thing you do have to be a little bit careful of when coloring leather with watered down dye, it will appear darker while it's wet than it is when it's dry. So sometimes I do have to let it dry completely before I am sure if I'm happy with it or not. And then I decided I was done with blue and I was going to add a little bit of red just to create some color variation. Again, I'm using a EcoFlow dye and adding the red in certain areas just to create some varied shades and tones. Just a reminder that all of the leather work I do is mostly a hobby. It's for my own enjoyment, so I'm not particularly concerned with efficiency. If I was making these to sell, I would make a whole bunch of them and I would dye all of them at the same time with an airbrush, and the process would be way faster. I made this project purely for fun, so I was just vibing, listening to my music and coloring away. It is a good reminder to let you guys know that. All right, so it's a little bit hard to tell right now because the leather is still quite wet, but I've got quite a variety of shades of color here, just reshaping the parts that have sagged due to the leather being wet so that when I leave this dye to dry, everything will hold the shape that I want it to once it's fully dry. These are the dyes that I used. We have EcoFlow Scarlet and EcoFlow Evening Blue. Here's how he looks all dry. So then I started to use some acrylic paints. Initially, I started off with some bronze on the horns, but I decided I didn't like that and I ended up using gold for everything. I started off really dry brushing this. So basically I'm filling the whole brush with paint and then rubbing almost all of it off so that it's just a little bit on the inside of the brush, and you can use that to gently add a little bit of highlight. I did end up going kind of ham with this, and by the end it was well beyond your basic dry brushing, but yeah, that's what it started out as. Here's a little bit more of a close-up of this. Added some highlights to the face and the bridge of the nose. And then I added gold to all of the spines on the dragon as well. At the beginning, I really thought I was going to go super light with the metallics, but in typical me fashion, I just kept going and going. And by the end, there was a lot of metallic on there. But you know what? Creating is a journey and you never know where it's going to end up. Just hitting all of the visible edges with gold to highlight them. And once I was happy, I set the dragon aside so the acrylic paint could dry. I didn't film it, but I did add a leather finish over the dye to seal it in place. So I made some little claws out of air dry clay. I did start to paint them, but that didn't work very well, so I'm just going to paint them again once they are in place. I'm just stretching out the holes a little bit so that the claws will fit into them properly. And I'm just using Gorilla wood glue for this. I kind of smudged it into the area where the claws are going to be, and now I'm feeding the claws through the holes, pressing them down into the glue so that the glue will immobilize them in place. I secured the beads for the eyes in the exact same way. I posted on Instagram asking for recommendations as to how to mount my dragon to the wall. There was a lot of really good suggestions. I liked the one of adding a wire armature to the back of the dragon. I thought that's the direction I was going to go in initially because I would be able to mount the dragon to the wall without anything being visible on the front side. Some other suggestions were mount it to a piece of wood that had a nice wood grain, mount it to the inside of a frame. But then I was going through my drawers of scrap. I'm a bit of a pack rat. I always keep bits and pieces of supplies from other projects because you never know when you might decide that you need them later. And I saw some cotton batting, and then that got the wheels turning, and I thought, well, what if I made him a little cloud? I had bought these battery operated LED lights, and I thought maybe I could make the cloud light up. I had some cotton batting that would be used for sewing, and I also had some kind of messy stuffing. I actually pulled this out of the stuffed Grogu that I bought when I was making my baby orc Grognach, and I had that left over. First up, I just grabbed a piece of cardboard and cut a rough cloud shape out of it. Then I just cut the rough shape out of the batting. I had bought a large package of these lights, and I decided that one strand wasn't going to be enough, so I incorporated a second strand. These lights have 3 modes. 2 of them flash, and one of them is a constant light. So I had roughly taped the strands into position with tape. Then I decided to come at this with a glue gun. I know hot glue is a go-to tool for most crafters, but I almost never use hot glue. But I did decide it was going to be the best thing for this project. I quickly realized I had to hold each wire in place for a few seconds so that it didn't shift while the glue dried. Because the battery packs had some thickness to them and I was going to stick them to the back side, I grabbed a little scrap of foam to put on the other sides of the cloud so that it would lie flat against the wall. I spread the little bits of stuffing all over the front of the cloud, and then I laid the cotton batting over the top of it. Then I flipped it upside down and started gluing the edges of the batting to the back of the cardboard. I worked in stages, running strips of glue and then pressing the batting down into the glue to hold it in place. I left the battery packs exposed so I would be able to turn the lights on and off and replace the batteries if needed. Now I'm just trying to figure out where exactly I'm going to place the dragon. I intentionally made my dragon shaped like an S because my name is Snapping Dragon and I wanted it to be part of my logo. I just added little dabs of glue where the dragon actually touches the batting, and I pressed it down into the batting until the glue dried. To hang it on the wall, I decided just to hot glue a strip of leather in place. This is a super hokey attachment method, but this thing is very light. And looky, my dragon is all done. I love him. I think it's really cool that the cloud lights up. I added him to my colorful nerdy gallery wall. If you want to make your own dragon, I have posted the pattern on my Etsy shop. And as always, there's a list of supplies and tools in the description.